Good evening and welcome to the Bethany Baptist Church Midweek Connection Point. It is Wednesday, January 20th. I hope you are doing well. Thank you for tuning in to this virtual time in God's Word, that you're carving out time to seek the Lord, to know Him and enjoy Him. There's many other things you could be doing tonight. So thank you for doing this. The Lord says that when we draw near to Him, He will draw near to us. And He rewards those who seek Him. So I pray that you'll be rewarded for meeting with me right now in God's Word. This evening will be in 1 Samuel chapter 23. 1 Samuel chapter 23. I'm going to read the whole chapter, and then I've got three simple things to encourage you in as we think about why God allows evil people in our lives, especially if you're a Christian, people that He could wipe off the face of this planet if He wanted to, but when He leaves them, what His good purposes are, especially for His elect, for those who are by faith trusting in Christ and come to know God in this way. So let's read 1 Samuel chapter 23. It says this: Now they told David, Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, Shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more than if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. Verse 6, When Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David to Keilah and had come down with an ephod in his hand. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. And Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, Bring the ephod here. And David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, He will come down. And David said, Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, They will surrender you. Then David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. And David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph, and Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. Verse 15, David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horosh, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horosh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this. And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horosh, and Jonathan went home. Verse 19, And the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horosh, on the hill of Hachilah, which is south of Jeshimon? Now come down, O king, according to all your heart's desire to come down, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. And Saul said, May you be blessed by the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Go, make yet more sure, know and see the place where David's foot is, and who has seen him there, for it is told me that he is very cunning. See therefore and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with this sure information. Then I will go with you, and if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah. And they arose and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. And Saul and his men went to seek him, and David was told, so he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul, saying, Hurry, come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land. So Saul returned from pursuing David and went against the Philistines. Therefore that place was called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. Here in the book of 1 Samuel, Saul is still pursuing David relentlessly as his enemy, though he thinks he's doing it in the name of God, is pursuing God's favored and anointed, the humble shepherd boy, David. He's just pursuing. It says every day Saul was trying to trap and to kill David. Every day. The story is many of those encounters of David almost being caught by Saul and then God preserving him each time. In fact, as verse 14 says, I think that's the theme of the text. But as we divide our text in three ways, here's a question I want to propose to you, help us drive the theme. If God had said that David would be king and Saul was no longer to be king, that Saul was wicked and David had found favor in the eyes of the Lord, then do you ever wonder this question? Why did God not just remove Saul? Either kill him or change his heart and bring him in line to stop making life so miserable for David, but to support him and follow him. Either one of those options God could have done. God could have struck down Saul dead the moment he gave the kingdom or promised it to David, or he could have changed his heart. He could have turned his heart like a river and made him less of a Pharaoh and more like a Cyrus of Persia. He could have done this, but God didn't. So why? Why? And then why do we get to see these things unfold? The relentless pursuit of Saul, David's enemy, towards him. Think about it. Could God really have done this? Could he have killed? Does he kill the enemies of his people sometimes? Yes, he does. God destroyed all the people on the earth in Noah's day, those who were set on evil. God rained down hellfire and brimstone and destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah when their threats to Lot had reached a fever pitch. In this book of 1 Samuel, when Eli was wicked, God said, "No longer will you be the priest, I'll kill you." And that very week, he heard the news of the Philistines raiding and stealing the ark. He fell over, broke his neck, and died. God judged Eli. He could have done that to Saul already. Why have you not done it, God? Or another one of David's enemies, Goliath. We hear of him threatening God's people, and God lets him be struck down dead with a sling and stones and decapitated. Why did God, if he loves David, he loves his people, why did he not do this to Saul right now? The reason why that question matters is because we live in a life like this. We have enemies as Christians, those who hate the gospel, those who persecute us, whether they be in the church, so-called church, or outside of the church, pagans and those who openly hate God, or Satan. Why has he not just killed Satan and removed all temptation and all trials and just given us a peaceful kingdom come on this earth? I'm going to propose to you three reasons from our text. Here's why. If God had went ahead and just killed Saul already, then David would have never learned these three things. David would have possibly never learned how to pray like we see him praying in this book. He would have never made godly friends like we see him making in this book. And he would have never found places of refuge, like the rock of escape that he found at the end of our chapter. So first, I want to show you how the pursuit, God allowing Saul to live. Enemies in this text, not just Saul, but the Calites and the Philistines. These people here, the Philistines. So we'll just see it quickly several times that this trouble leads David to pray. There's injustice in the land. Is there injustice in our land? There is. Verse 1, the injustice of the Philistines taking advantage and robbing the Calites leads to him to do what in verse 2? Pray. Oh God, shall we put an end to this wickedness? God, what shall I do? But trouble doesn't go away. He looks to his own men, and his men are afraid. No. We're not united with you, David. We're afraid. So their disunity. Why does God not remove disunity from all of our churches? Disunity in our homes. Disunity even in our own personality and thoughts. But it leads him to pray. The disunity in verse 3 leads him in verse 4 to inquire of the Lord again. So he prayed against injustice. Now he prays for God to help this disunity, and God answers. He unites the people, and He's learned 2 steps of prayer there. Then we get to verses 6 and 7. It's not just that the Philistines are a problem, but now Saul is still pursuing him. Saul has found out where David is, and Saul is going to come and try to kill him. So verse 9, David knew that Saul was plotting against him, and what does it lead him to do? Remember, if Saul had been wiped out, then no plot against him, would David have continued in prayer? He grabs the man of God, Abiathar, who has the ephod, this right to pray and direct access to God. And he says in verse 10, "Oh, Lord God, your servant has heard this. Will you grant the victory? What should I do?" Verse 12 again. If God had removed all Philistines with Goliath, or if he had removed Saul with Saul's first sin, would David had need to plead, to cry out to God, not just over monumental decisions, but each moment, each step in his day, as we see here. Friends, I know this from experience, that it is the troublemakers in the church, it is the temptations in my own crooked heart, it is the trials going on in our nation in COVID. They lead me to pray on my face every day. Times of adversity are the times I pray the most, so that I'm dependent upon God the most. My lips for prayer and my language increases, my fervency of prayer. Has it been so in your life? Has God allowed trials to give you some of the sweetest, most desperate, without ceasing times of prayer? If God would have taken the Philistines and Saul out already, would David have learned to pray like this? Friends, David was praying at monumental decisions. Should I go and do this great thing? But also momentary decisions. Should I go over here today? Will I respond this way? We should pray about big things. Should our church pursue a plurality of elders? Should so-and-so move here and uproot their family? Should I take this job? Those are monumental things, but David's also learning prayer in the moment-by-moment things. Lord, what text should I preach as I preach about elders? Should we induce labor for this baby that's coming? Moment by moment, not just monumental decisions. Should I go spend time discipling this person today? Or spend extra time with my family and my children? Monumental and momentary decisions. It's the trials, it's the constant affliction, the constant worries that teach us to pray and to commune with God. See that in the first third of our text. The second thing is that if God had taken Saul and all the threats to David out of his life, David would have never made or found friends like the ones he did. In fact, David starts in his pursuit of the Lord all alone, but it is the continued threats of Saul and the Philistines that God brings more and more godly people around him to rely upon him. In chapter 22, there were just 400 men. But then God brings another godly one in verse 6. Abiathar, the son of Elimelech, he fled to David. Would David have ever found such a godly friend as Abiathar if Saul had not wreaked havoc in Abiathar's life and in David's life? I'm thankful for Abiathar's in my life. I know that David would be thankful for this friend. David had one friend, and he had 400, and then we see in verse 13, the continual pursuit, the unrelenting pursuit of temptation and the enemy and wickedness in the world leaves David's godly friends to grow from not just 400 and 401 to 600. Look at verse 13. Then David and his men, who were about 600, they arose and departed from Keilah. You see that God is assembling more and more godly friends. New friendships are being created that would have never happened before through these adversities. When you go through a divorce, or when you go through a miscarriage, or when you go through COVID, you make friends with people who have gone through similar things, who have cried those tears, who have survived those trials. In fact, the best friend that David makes is Jonathan. Look at verse 15. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. So persecution remains. God didn't kill Saul. He allowed Saul to keep seeking his life. David's in the wilderness at Horesh, and then God brings this godly friend. Has he brought friends like this to you in your life? Have you discovered deeper, genuine, godly, gospel-centered friendships from these kind of trials? Verse 16, Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. In fact, this says a lot about your trials. If your trials are leading you to make friends with the world or to pull away from the church, I would say that your trials are not being used the way that God intended, and you're responding to trials the wrong way. But if trials cause you to know Christians better, to pray with them deeper, to confess sins and to seek their accountability, to be strengthened in the Lord, then God is using what the devil means for harm, he's using for good. Jonathan here, some of my most godly friends were born in and through times of adversity. I think about my difficult years at Murray State University, and a man by the name of Bob Warren came and preached at the BCM one night, and I'd never heard preaching from the Bible like this, and I went and I became his friend. He invited me to his home to do Bible study every Tuesday night for the rest of that semester. Bob Warren was born, found a new friend like that, a godly friend. I think about as an associate pastor at Living Hope in Hopkinsville, and just it's hard being an associate pastor sometimes, and maybe God's calling you to be a senior pastor or just working with staff and things like that. And I met another associate pastor in town by the name of Brandon Boone, a godly pastor who was just called to pastor back in Hopkinsville again as a senior pastor at Edgewood Baptist Church. We met and we had coffee, and we related in some of our struggles as associate pastor. That brother would have never come unless the trials of being an associate pastor or just being a pastor had not come. I'm thankful for God allowing trouble to still happen in my life. And godly men at the church I'm at right now, like Nelson and Steve Maston, who understand the difficulties of pastoring and shepherding and being patient and gently leading sheep and knowing when to use the rod and to be more stern. Would have never been as good of friends with people like Nelson or Brent or Steve Maston in this way. So I'm thankful for them. Even just recently, I've seen men in our church and in adversity within our church or in the lives of our community rise up recently to be like Jonathan's and to fight for the truth, to seek unity where there's disunity, to take it upon themselves, not to just watch others suffer, but to come in and relieve that suffering. I've seen it. My friendships have increased. I've been so proud of the men of God and the women of God in my life of recent. It's a beautiful thing, but if Saul had not been allowed to continue living and Philistines continue to wage war, would these friends, would these times of deliverance and companionship and support, would they have ever been known? I don't think so. Third and lastly, if God had removed Saul, removed all threats, and just given David a life of peace, would he have ever found such unique places, monumental places of deliverance? You see, in our text from the beginning, Saul and the Philistines are pursuing David. He's in one cave in Keilah, and then he has to migrate, and he finds God and Abiathar in the place in verses 6 through 14, in the place of Horish. Verse 18, the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, David, and he remained at Horish. So this pursuit of him is making him find new godly connections in different places, new prayer closets, new places outdoors to meet with God, these places that he would never forget, monumental places of refuge that he found God in the midst of storms. Verses 19 through 29 highlight that theme. In fact, the enemies of David, some of Saul's minions, they discover that he's here and they chase David. They chase him, and there's this like awesome, ironic time to where they're chasing to find David on this side of the mountain, and David's kind of skirting this side of the mountain, and God's delivering him. God just in the nick of time saves him. And then in verse 27, they're getting ready to catch David. Saul's people are coming to David, and they're just getting ready to catch him. And then God, probably in answer to prayer or just his kindness and his mercy, sends a messenger to Saul. He's about to catch David and says, "Oh no, all these Philistines are over here. Go catch them." And so they go over here at the last minute, and David is safe at this rock, safe at this unique place. Verse 28, it says, "So Saul returned from pursuing David and went against the Philistines. Therefore that place on the map, that place in his life, that moment would have never been discovered, but that place is discovered, and it's called the Rock of Escape." So he gets a name. it gets a plaque, so to speak, so that all other Christians who travel those roads for years, everyone who reads the Bible for thousands of years would say there are places in the wilderness where God miraculously meets with his people and delivers them. I know in my life, if God had not allowed Sauls to live on and Philistines to rage and the tempter to keep poking and tempting, there would have not been places in my life have been discovered where surely God has been in these places. They're homes of godly people. Bob Warren, the basement of his study, meeting on those Tuesday nights at Murray State University, or the house on Slaughter Road of my mama who's gone to be with the Lord, where we read the Bible together in some of my greatest times of depression as a student away in the middle of nowhere in Mayfield. That's the middle of nowhere, Kentucky. My prayer closet at Dry Ridge Road. Anytime I go back to visit my dad, I open up that door and I just think about that place. There are times where God met with me in high school adversity and trials, and God showed up there. That place is not necessarily sacred, but I know that God was faithful to me in times of wilderness and wandering and difficulty. I think of Wayne and Mary Boyd's house in high school. Thursday nights there in our young men's D group. I think about praying with Wayne and other men struggling with purity, young men in high school and in college. I think about times in my car at Land Between the Lakes. I think about even this rug here in my room at times where things have been difficult at church and I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what emails to write. I didn't even want to leave this room and fall on my face on that carpet, and God promised deliverance, and God strengthened me according to his word and according to his spirit, and reminded me of other places of deliverance. So we would like for the Sauls to cease. We would like for the Philistines to all be decimated. We would like for the tempter to be able to tempt no more. But as God told David in verse 11 of our text, Saul will come. Saul is still alive, but I will deliver you out of his hand all the time. Let me give one last illustration, one story. One of the godly men in my life, his name is Brent. He's a former pastor and a director of missions in Kentucky. And through some of the adversity over the last couple of years of my life, I'd call him as an outsider who's not involved in our community but understands pastor and just share with him some of my griefs. And he gave these words of advice. And so I'll just talk about one time when things were going well. And I said, Brent, things are going well. And he said, Lucas, I'm happy for you. It's good. But beware, when things are going well, you will let your guard down and you might become prideful. You might pray less and you might be dependent on help from others less. And then even just recently, I called him again and he used the same advice in the opposite direction. I told him recently how things were difficult in my personal life and in pastoring. And he said, Lucas, I've learned to be thankful for those moments, to be thankful for the Sauls, to praise God for the Shimei's who curse us and the Philistines that are always around us, because those are the times where I've learned to pray, where I've learned to be desperate to go towards God, where I've been more careful with my words and more serious about the pursuit of holiness in my character and keeping up a quiet time to know God. And so I think Brent was providentially speaking in my life. I want Sauls out, we want Philistines out, we want Satan to cease, but those are the times where we're closest to God and where we need him. So I'll end with this statement. You think about David's life and how he was always on the run right here from Saul, and he was desperate in prayer, but there was a time when all of his enemies ceased for a while, and he was relaxed, and he was prideful, and he was at ease, and he stood upon his mansion, and he looked down, and in his sin, he took Bathsheba. I wonder if you, or I wonder if David, I wonder if we asked ourselves this question, what we would rather have. And it's this. It started with a question, and end with a question. Would you rather be constantly running from the evil hands of Sauls and Philistines? Or would you really prefer a life of ease where you're in sin and in the arms of a Bathsheba? Pride, arrogance, godliness, things that often come with a life of ease. and arrogance. I think, I hope, I wonder if they would look back and say, these were the times that were best for my soul. I hope you're able to say the same. I hope you know Christ in this way. I hope you'll run to God. You will pray to Him. You will find that Jesus is the best of friends, and in that place of communion with Him, you will know God. Love you all. Have a good night.